So we're ready to go, Stephen. Thank you for your patience with the technical stuff. I have never done this before. Um, I've never done a live interview online, and I've never done a Twitch interview. So I very much appreciate you coming on. First, um, I'd like to introduce you briefly. Steven Newcomb, whose ancestry is Shawnee and Lenape, is one of the world's leading scholars on the doctrine of discovery and domination, as well as the author of the best-selling book Pagans in the Promised Land: Decoding the Doctrine of Christian Discovery, which was published in 2008. Stephen is a co-producer of the documentary movie The Doctrine of Discovery: Unmasking the Domination Code, directed and produced by Sheldon Wolfchild, who is Dakota origin, with narration by Buffy St. Marie, who is Cree. In 1992, Steven Newcomb, along with Virgil Kills Strait, who's Oglala Lakota, founded the Indigenous Law Institute and began a global campaign to call upon the Holy See. I always thought that was a bizarre name for a person, the Holy See, to revoke the Vatican Papal Bull of Discovery and Domination of May 4, 1493. That campaign has developed into a worldwide movement, which you can view at originalfreenations.com. We're going to spend the first half hour in conversation, and in the second half hour, I'll start to review any questions that viewers have put in the chat box. And I understand that you need to register with Twitch in order to put in questions into the chat box. I'm going to do one more thing, which is that um, I had to switch over to a different sound. Can you still hear me, Stephen?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right. I think I had the wrong microphone on. So here we go. So Stephen, welcome to our first ever Community Rights US Twitch marathon. I first encountered you, if my memory is correct, at the annual Environmental Law Conference in Eugene, Oregon, which is an international conference of lawyers and law professors and environmental activists. I want to just get started by asking you, we're going to spend most of the hour talking about the doctrine of discovery. Am I correct that it's actually the full title is the Doctrine of Discovery and Domination?
Well, before we get right into the interview, let me acknowledge my friend and mentor, Virgil Killstraight. He passed to the spirit world in February of 2019. And so I wanted to acknowledge him and say that without his mentorship and without his guidance, I would not be the person today or doing the work that I'm doing. And my goodness, that was more than 25 years ago. I think that you and I must have met then, if it was the LAW Land Air Water Conference there
Yeah.
in Eugene, Oregon. That's going back to when I first pretty much began working with Virgil, and quite a long time ago. And then also thank you to all the organizers, and thank you to you, Paul, for having me on here. I really appreciate it. With regard to the doctrine of discovery, it was always called that. That's how I understood it to be named. This notion, this idea that the first Christian people to locate lands uninhabited by Christians, that somehow those Christian people supposedly had a right to claim an ultimate dominion over the native peoples and nations that were already living in that place. Over time, in more recent years, I came to realize that we were disserved by focusing on discovery, and that the real true importance of what we're talking about is the assertion of a claim of a right of domination. So, what these documents of the 15th century, the Vatican Papal Bulls, are asserting is that when Christians or the representatives of Christian monarchs go to a land that they were previously unaware of or had no knowledge of, that they had the perfect right from the Pope or from God or from the King to assert a right of domination over that place. And we can get into the language in those documents that back up what I'm saying. But that became the foundation of federal Indian law and policy. over time, the U.S. Supreme Court, the people on the court, such as John Marshall and Joseph Story and others, they articulated those notions into legal decisions and created concepts and arguments that said that they, meaning the United States, had a right of domination that they could assert or exert over original nations and peoples. And that's still the case today.
It's really quite extraordinary to me that the Catholic Church continues to have. I mean, it was functioning as a global government at the time, and it still, because of its power with the Doctrine of Discovery, it continues to function even through current U.S. Supreme Court decisions, I understand. That Catholicism has had such an outsized role in the control over indigenous people worldwide. Can you talk something about how the Catholics became so powerful?
Well, it's an institution that dates back to the Roman Empire. And so it's an institution of the Roman Empire that's still existing in the 21st century. And the monarch of that empire, of the empire of the Roman Catholic Church, if you want to talk about it that way, the monarch is the Pope. And so it is a type of monarchy. They probably would call him a prince more than a pope, or more than a king. But nonetheless, it has an international personality that's recognized in international law. And by the way, the term Holy See is referring to the seat, the office or the seat of the Pope, or of the papacy, of the Vatican, as it's now more contemporarily called. Now, how it ended up with such power is obviously a very long story, and it has to do with the way in which the popes were, for such a long time, operating as a very important monarchy, so to speak, kind of using language a little bit loosely, but with tremendous power and tremendous influence through its ability to issue documents and the ability to grant supposed rights of what I call domination. But when you have the ability to simply put words on paper and set into motion the kind of events that took place over centuries and centuries, and then benefit financially from that, obviously you end up with a lot of power, a lot of influence, and a lot of wealth.
And was this something, my understanding is you went to the University of Oregon in 1975 thinking of becoming an attorney. I mean, at what point in your history as a human being did you even start being aware of this historical record? And was that part of why you wanted to be an attorney?
Yeah, as a teenager, I began to, I really had no particular connection with our culture, language, traditions as a young person in our family. Um, but as I got into my teenage years, I had the good fortune of meeting medicine people and elders and folks from the reservations, and began. I had a very deep desire to know more about the history of what had happened to our peoples, and tried to get a sense of identity. What did it mean to be a Native person, especially when we had been essentially cut off from everything that you could identify as some aspect of our language, culture, or traditions? And it's a horrible place to be in terms of a sense of place in the world, a sense of identity in the world that you can be comfortable with. And so, as a result of the guidance from those elders and other folks, more traditionally minded Native people, I also had a great affinity for reading. I was a very avid reader of all kinds of things. And so, one of the things that I did end up doing is reading Vine Deloria Jr.'s God is Red, along with Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee and Custer Died for Your Sins. There was a whole body of literature from that time. I was in my teens then. And in the book God is Red, Vine Deloria Jr. quotes a section of the Vatican Papal Bull of 1493. So that was kind of tucked somewhere in my mind. And then when I ended up at the University of Oregon in 1975, I decided to major in rhetoric and communication. And the University of Oregon had a terrific rhetoric department at that time. And so I thought this would be a great preparation for law school. I could become an attorney and be an advocate for the people and that sort of thing. And then I took a federal Indian law course from Charles Wilkinson, and I think it was around 1981. And what ended up happening is I ended up reading Johnson versus McIntosh. And when I saw, which is a decision from 1823, written by Chief Justice John Marshall, which articulates or expresses this whole idea of discovery that we're talking about. When I read that decision, I happened to notice that Marshall put italics on the words Christian people. And he used Christian prince or people, Christian people numerous times because he was quoting from various English charters, such as the charter to John Cabot and his sons, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, Sir Walter Raleigh, and the Virginia charters and so forth. So when I saw the italics on the terms, the words Christian people, and saw that Marshall had made a distinction between Christian people and natives who were heathens, that stuck in my mind. And I remembered what I had read about in Vine Deloria Jr.'s book. And I remembered the section of the Papal Bull that I had read some years earlier, 6 or 7 years earlier, and I put the two together. And as a result of that, I knew there had to be some definite connection, but I didn't know what that connection might be. A number of events happened in my own life where I stopped attending university, and a whole number of reasons for that. But over the next decade, I did my own research. I continued with my own research and writing and so forth, using my rhetorical training at the university to begin to put all this information together. And after a decade, I met Virgil Kilstrade, and a number of things happened. It was 1992 on New Year's, and my wife and I had gone out, and it was about midnight, and that Old Lang Syne or whatever the heck that song is came on, and we hugged each other, and I felt as if someone had flipped a light switch. And I said, in my mind, I said, "Here we go." And what I meant by that was it was about to begin. Everything I had prepared for was about to begin. After that, I met Virgil. All these different things started to move. There was a momentum that happened spiritually and so forth to launch us on this path, set us on this path. So here we are.
I remember meeting Wilkinson at a native powwow decades ago. I think he's since passed, if I remember correctly.
I think he's still kicking around.
Is he? Okay.
So.
Oops.
I believe so. Yeah, I
Very
believe
good.
so. Yeah.
Hopefully. Yeah, I grew
so.
up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and although I never actually met a native person properly face to face, which I still blame my parents for that lapse, we did visit a lot of native pueblos as a child and a teenager, and we went to Chaco Canyon, and we went to other places. And I still remember being absolutely shocked and horrified at Chaco Canyon as a 15 or 16-year-old, I think, to read that there had been this thriving, massive native city there in the Four Corners area. And in the 1400s, they just miraculously disappeared, and nobody knew where they had gone. If I remember, I could be getting the dates wrong. And also, interestingly enough, right around that same time, the Catholic Church arrived in the village and set up a mission right in the middle of the village. And the description on the plaque made no connection between these two things happening. Can you talk a little bit about the significance of something like that? I mean, I kept seeing these kinds of historical oddities visiting native historical sites in New Mexico as a kid, and how that connects to the doctrine of discovery.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing of it is where the Catholic Church has gone in terms of a force for colonization, to use the language of the Papal Bull, to propagate the Christian empire, Christiani Imperii Propagationem. And it's right in the Papal Bull that they're involved in an imperial enterprise, as much as they might talk about conversion and religion and baptism and those things. The behind it, the political dimension, the political part of the arrangement is that they are about power and control over others. And so this is my understanding, and you can look at the history of that. Now, I don't know about those dates that you mentioned. There may be something, a disconnect there. Obviously, those dates don't quite match up with the historical record going back to 1400s. But nonetheless, we do know that when the representatives of the Catholic Church and of the Spanish conquistadors went to those places, um, uh, whatever place it was, their intention was to establish a system of domination where it did not yet exist. Now, how do we know that to be true? In the Papal Bull of May 3rd, 1493, you have language in Latin that states the following: Que sub actuali dominio temporali alicorum dominorum Christianorum constitute non essent. And what that means is lands that are not established or constituted under the domination, dominio, of any Christian dominorum Christianorum. So what that tells us is that they're going in search of lands, of places that do not yet have a system of domination established on top of them. And it's their goal, it's their objective, it's their mission to establish that system of domination in that new place. And so that's why you have this horrible impact and horrible effect on all of the original nations and peoples, no matter where the Catholic Church and the engine of colonization went, or from any country, because even after you had the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism, that didn't matter one whit, because it was the same objective to establish empire and domination where it did not exist before. And so that's the critical part. And then the way in which that plays out today is that the United States government, according to the Johnson versus McIntosh ruling, claims that it is the sovereign of any place that it has a claim over, an assertion of ultimate dominion over, as Chief Justice Marshall puts it. And therefore, the native peoples only have a right of occupancy, which is not a property right. And when it's not a property right, there's no right of domination that goes over it. That creates a vacuum of domination, and nature abhors a vacuum. So the Christian European colonizers fill in that vacuum with their own concept, their own idea of their right of domination.
It's just
They have
such
that means they
horrific.
have the right to all of the waters, all of the land, all of the resources, and they create a system of domination called property. And that's what they're operating on the basis of to this day, based on the Bible and Christianity.
And the U.S. Constitution, which is not explicitly a Christian document, is all about the right of property and the right of commerce and very little else, as really the definition of freedom and liberty for all. It's all couched in terms of property and commerce.
It's liberty and freedom for the. So it's the American empire.
You're starting to have some audio problems, Stephen. Like some of your sentences are not coming through.
Okay.
I'm just wondering if we should take a short break and whether you
let's
could
do that.
put a mic, try a headset and see where that
That'd
goes.
be good.
We'll take a break for about 1 minute. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Does that help at all?
Hold on just a sec.
Okay, can you hear me now, Paul?
Yes, your sound sounds really good.
Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah.
Should have done that to begin with.
Okay, let's come back on. I think, alrighty. I think I figured out how to keep Twitch on with the Oh, so to techies out there who are listening, I just restarted Twitch and there is no stream chat. So I guess I've lost everything that's come before now, unfortunately. So we'll have to deal with that in about 5 or 10 minutes when we take a longer break. But getting back to you, Steven. Let's see here. Okay, we're back on. So what I find so extraordinary about all of this is that this is not some, horrific barbarian history of conquering people of color all over the planet. It's not just that, it's happening to this very day. My understanding is that the US Justice Department, related to the Johnson and McIntosh decision on February 5 of this year, I understood, listening to you from a previous interview you did recently.
Yeah.
And I understand that the U.S. Supreme Court regularly still names the doctrine of discovery in some of its decision making. Can you talk about the enormous significance this continues to play in the United States and around the world?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's important to understand that the concepts I'm talking about, the ideas that I'm talking about, and the arguments that the United States government has developed are a continuity. In other words, there's no disconnection. We can say, oh, well, this is 2021, so what connection does that have to 1823? Well, because of the nature of precedent, that which preceded the current moment, and the way in which those same ideas and arguments were repeated over and over and over again, each and every generation, the most recent generation is still utilizing the same ideas and arguments that were developed centuries ago or generations ago or whatever the case may be. And that's why people like Chief Justice Marshall or Joseph Story and other members of the Supreme Court were referencing those ancient documents. In their generation, they were looking back to documents from centuries past because they were going to use those same ideas and arguments in their generation. And then this generation looks back to those earlier generations and utilizes the same information, but they don't have to revisit the whole pattern of argument. They simply have to cite to the title of the case where those arguments were made. And then they piece that all together into the most recent decision. So in the case of the February 5th legal brief that was submitted by the U.S. Justice Department to the U.S. District Court for the District of Arizona in a matter regarding a request for a temporary injunction in the Oak Flat case, the Apache Stronghold case, where they were requesting a temporary injunction against Rio Tinto mine and whatever mining interests there are there in Oak Flat. They wanted to have an injunction against any possibility of that land being transferred and so forth. The Justice Department cited to Tehiton Indians versus the United States from 1955, which cites to the Johnson versus McIntosh ruling, which cites to Joseph Story's commentaries and also Henry Wheaton's Elements of International Law. That's more detail than your listeners need to have, but suffice it to say that all of the information about the papal bulls, about the patterns of domination, and all of that are contained in that legal brief from February 5th of this year. It means they're reaching back centuries into the past, taking the reasoning process of Christians and Christian monarchs against heathens and infidels and using them this year against original nations and peoples. That's how the whole thing is maintained under cover of the rule of law. They just have to call it rule of law and use these titles and the various arguments, and that it's not the average person that will understand anything that I'm talking about. In fact, it's a very, very rare individual that would know how to put all these pieces together. Somebody like my friend Peter Dorico, that taught for 30 years at University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He's an example. There are others, but we're the ones that are calling it Christian discovery and Christian domination because that's consistent with the actual language from all those centuries ago.
speak more. In a previous recent interview you did, um, you talked at some length about how the doctrine of discovery impacts our ideas and our behaviors today as a general public. And there was a quote that you said you ask in some of your work, quote, "Do you speak domination?" unquote. Um, and the domination translator work that you're doing around civilization, state, empire, sovereignty,
Right.
colonizer, et cetera, et cetera. Could you spend a few minutes
Sure.
unpacking that, and then we'll take a short break?
That'd be great. Let me go back to your prior question because you did ask about the Supreme Court, and I didn't answer that part of the question. In 2005, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, used the doctrine of discovery in footnote number 1 in the case City of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation of New York. So that was 2005. So that's not that many years ago. In 2014, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals referred to Teton Indians versus United States and Johnson v. McIntosh in a case called White versus University of California, a Kumeyaay ancestral remains case. So this is very much an active way of arguing an active doctrine and so forth. And what they're doing, to go into your question that you just posed, what they're using in what they're doing is applying a vocabulary of domination in the sense of a chess game. And all they have to do is move their chess pieces, which are their words, their vocabulary, around in a certain manner, and it's checkmate before the native people even sit down at the table because they've already got those pieces prearranged. Now, what by that I mean, for example, civilization, state, sovereignty, ascendancy, dominion, property, and empire. That's 7 terms of domination. But if you read off those words to the average person and you said, what do these words mean? I would venture to say that not one person would say that any of those words, in other words, the first thing that comes out of their mouth or the first thing that comes to mind for them would not be domination. And it might not even ever enter into the mix. They would say, well, that means whatever. And they would never say the word domination. So it just so happens that I have been at this such a long time, and because I pay attention to patterns, I began to notice this patterning whereby, for example, civilization means the forcing of a particular cultural pattern on a population to which it is foreign. That's a process of domination.
Wow.
The word state is a relation of men dominating men, according to Max Weber, the very famous German sociologist. If the state is to exist, the dominated must submit themselves to the authority claimed by the powers that be. That means you have to have a structure of dominated and dominators in order to have a state. It's actually a state of domination that goes by a different name, whether it be California or Nevada or Oregon or Washington or whatever the name might be. It's the state of domination called such and such. And the next one is ascendancy. Chief Justice Marshall in the Johnson ruling said of the native people, well, of the continent, actually, he said the character and religion of its inhabitants, referring to the continent's inhabitants, afforded an apology for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. And ascendancy means controlling influence, governing power, domination. So, over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim a right of domination is the domination translator version of that sentence. And then the next one is sovereignty, which Jonathan Havercroft defined as an unjust form of political domination that limits human freedom. And the next one is dominion, which, well, property actually, let's go to property next, which is not the material object itself, but the right of domination rightfully obtained over that object. So there you go, a domination again. Or
Like
you could
nature.
say everything.
Everything.
So domination means domination over everyone and everything. So the first establishment of socially approved physical domination over some part of the natural world was the definition given by Charles Liebman Lance Liebman and Charles Monroe Haar in their textbook on property law. And then you also have dominion, which is the root of that is domo, which means to subjugate, to subdue, to force into subservience, to tame, to domesticate, to cultivate, and to till. That's a whole paradigm. And colere in Latin is to colonize and to design. And so you can keep breaking it down. Colon is the root of colonize. The colon is the digestive tract of the predator body politic, coming in on top of the original nations and peoples and devouring everything, digesting everything. And then colo is the root of colon, which means to filter out impurities in the process of mining. So all of it goes back to mining and the extraction of minerals, extraction of data, extraction of whatever it is from everyone and everything for the acquirement of riches and wealth. And the word America is ame, which means love, and Rika, which is riches and wealth, the love of riches and wealth, which is greed. And the American dream is the dream of life, liberty, and the pursuit of Indian land, because that's their happiness.
That is a potent collection of redefinitions. That's extraordinary. Thank you. So we're going to take a couple-minute break in just a moment.
Yeah.
But first, I want to remind our listeners and viewers that this is one of the early hours of a 28 or 30-hour fundraiser that Community Rights US is doing on Twitch for the first time ever. And I want to encourage everyone who's watching to think about making a donation over the next few minutes as we take a short break. Literally $1, $5, $10, $20 all makes an enormous difference to us. And so we'll break for just a couple minutes. I'm going to play a short video about Community Rights US, and we'll be back in about 3 minutes or so. So stand by. Thank you, Steven. See you in just a minute.
Did you know it's illegal for local governments to pass laws that protect their communities from controversial corporate activities like oil pipelines, genetically modified crops, fracking, and clear-cut logging?
Did you know that corporations have more constitutionally protected rights than people do?
Enter the community rights movement.
Since 1999, 200 towns, cities, and counties in 9 states have passed locally enforceable laws that ban specific harmful corporate activities and put decision-making back in the hands of local people.
We want to bring this incredibly successful community-based strategy to every community in this country.
We've assembled an amazing network of people and organizations to provide communities with the support and training that they need to run successful community rights campaigns.
Our work is conventional single-issue activism. We think of it as a rights-based, which allows progressives and conservatives to have a much easier time coming together to protect the health, safety, and welfare of residents and the local environment. Community rights lawmaking can protect our right to clean water and safe food, our right to free and fair elections, our right to living wage jobs, and our right to a renewable energy future.
But this movement is about more than just reclaiming our local lawmaking. It is also about catalyzing a profound culture shift.
Imagine the possibilities in your community if more and more of your neighbors and coworkers could envision themselves as taking an active role in the governance of their own communities.
We are, in fact, we the people. That is where our ultimate power and authority resides.
Your contribution will greatly expand the reach of the community rights movement.
Thank you for your support and for sharing our fundraising campaign with others. Okay, we're back with Steven Newcomb, one of the world's leading indigenous authorities on the doctrine of discovery, which is something that I had never heard of until college, and probably most people in this country have never heard of still, at least most white folk. It's a truly fascinating and horrific piece of history. I'm a longtime teacher and community organizer in the community rights movement, and when I do weekend-long workshops, which I've been doing for a couple decades, I pull out some text from Richard Grossman, who's one of the founders of the movement to look at the history of corporate constitutional rights. And I read from a speech that he gave many years ago where he talks about 1407, the sovereign King Henry IV of England chartered the Company of Merchants and Adventurers, ancestor of the East India Company, granting it monopoly control over exports of certain manufacturers. 1553, the Crown chartered the Russian Company. 1553, it chartered the Africa Company. 1557, the Spanish Company, each given special privileges and monopolies to control the trade across seas, monopoly control. The Eastland Company, 1578, on and on. 1605, the East India Company, first corporate charter given by a monarch that was in perpetuity for the first time ever in history. How does this history, and then of course, looking at more recent history, Hudson's Bay Company, which was given authority over everything that is now Canada and part of what is now the United States. And then the original colonies of the United States were all crown corporations chartered by the monarch, given incredible authority over everyone who was already living here. Can you just talk about how all of that ties in with the doctrine of discovery?
Well, yeah, and let me reiterate that it's best referred to as the doctrine of domination, because as long as we keep saying doctrine of discovery, what we're doing is we're reaffirming and we're actually directing attention away from the theme of domination onto the locating part of the equation, so that it's, let's go locate these areas that we can establish domination over, and then we'll only talk about the locating of rather than the domination of those places. And that's why I keep emphasizing domination, because that's naming the actual intention and the exact things that you're identifying with these charters. It's extraordinary to think all I got to do is pull out a piece of paper and a pen, and I can just start putting words on this thing, and I hereby claim the right to whatever, assume domination over anybody's house on this street. And so I go down this, hey, I got this document here. I have the authority to do such and such to enter your house and take it over. And if you don't like that, then we'll just beat you into submission. Well, claiming that you have authority based upon a document, nobody ever tried to impeach that evidence or that testimony, so to speak, by saying, I don't think so. And so any of those monarchs only had a rightful jurisdiction within their own lands, within their own domain. As soon as they stepped outside of their own land, their own territory, they had zero authority, because their jurisdiction only goes conterminous with their own boundaries. But if they can bluff everybody and say, hey, I'm going to give this document to you and you carry it with you, and wherever you go, you claim you have the authority from me because I gave it to you, and God gave it to me first, that's why I can give it to you. And then you go there, and if you can beat them into submission and establish that system of domination, then it works, voila, as if by magic. And that's exactly how it works, through mind control, through physical control, through the use of language, through the use of manipulation, coercion, duress, all the other things that go with establishing domination. And in the Papal Bull of 1452, you see the exact pattern listed, because the king of Portugal is supposedly, I say supposedly, authorized by the Pope to go to the western coast of Africa. And here come the words: invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue. Invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue. There's the formula. If you can invade, if you can capture, if you can vanquish, if you can subdue, now you've got the starting point for the whole system of domination that entitles you to everything and everyone. And then it says reduce them from their current state down to perpetual slavery, which is a form of ownership of other human beings, but you got to classify them as being non-human so that you can consider them to be a piece of property. And the Portuguese chronicler, I forget the name, but there's a Portuguese chronicler who refers to having captured 44 pieces. Well, they're human beings as we would understand it, but in their mindset, from their worldview, those were just pieces of whatever that they could then capture, and that's now pieces of property that they've taken into their possession. So that it's this whole formulation of an agenda and a set of techniques by using a pen and a paper, or in those days maybe it was a feather pen, whatever, but using ink and paper. When we went and saw the two original papal bulls, Dr. Deborah Harry and my friend Sharon Van and I went to see two of the original papal bulls at the archives of the Indies in Seville, Spain. And when they pulled them out, they were written on lambskin parchment with octopus ink,
Oh my
which is
God.
permanent ink and indelible. And it was this golden brown ink, and it looked like it had been written yesterday. And they keep it in this leather
Oh my God.
zipper pouch, like a artist case that you flip open and have paintings in there. In this instance, they had the papal bulls in there, and they were 520 years old to the day from when we were given the permission to see them.
Incredible.
This is how it's done. This is the magic of the whole
Right.
exercise, right?
Voila.
Yeah, voila.
Yeah. We've got a bunch of questions that I'm going to jump into. Before we do that, I just want to remind everybody that this is a fundraiser for Community Rights US. We're in the first hours of a 28 or 30-hour live stream on Twitch with some extraordinary presenters and performers. So please scroll down on the Twitch page to where it says, click here to donate. And seriously, even if you can just donate $1 or $2 or $5 or $10, it really makes a difference for us. We're trying to reach new audiences on Twitch. So I have a question here from Anna. I want to know more about the papal bull, whatever it is, to point out the technique was instilling or fueling the fear of death, so hypocritical to one of what the church says is Jesus's main messagery, everlasting life. Is that something you can respond to?
We got to die to have everlasting life, right?
That's for sure.
So you got to be saved. The thing is that the papal bulls are written in code. You asked me a little while ago about the domination translator. So I gave you the example of invade, capture, vanquish, subdue. The domination translator technique is to take those words, and you could either do it after one of them, each of them rather, or all of them. Then you put in brackets the word domination in red lettering to indicate that you've flagged a pattern of domination at that point in the text. And if you came across Christiani Imperii, meaning Christian Empire, you can put domination in brackets again in red lettering. And if you have a massacre, if you're looking at a massacre, the account of a terrible massacre like Wounded Knee, you could put domination in brackets again. And you could take a paragraph that might be 30 words long, and it would have a number of these horrific instances of domination in the text. And you could read it without any awareness of this domination translator technique. Just read it as an ordinary person approaching any ordinary text, and you might say, gosh, that's just horrible, that's just so terrible, and you go on and read the very next thing, but you never were aware of the fact of the domination patterns in that text. So if you insert the domination throughout the text, you might find that there are 5 examples of domination in just those 30 words that you were completely unaware of. But once you put the word domination in brackets in the text, suddenly what was in the background is the operating system is now in the foreground because you've brought it forward and made people fully aware of it.
It's been
And
unveiled.
it's been unveiled and made explicit. And my next book, Built by Blood of the Indians, is the working title, is going to have examples of how to use the domination translator.
Very, very cool. Okay. Our board member, Carla, asks, which leaders today do you believe are most effective at exposing how the doctrine of domination is being used? And which current figures do you believe are most effective at resisting or dismantling the legal structures and institutions that perpetuate the doctrine of domination? Do we have any leaders who
Well,
are exposing?
we did at just a while back. Chairman Joe De Gowdy of the Yakama Nation, while he was in office, he did everything he could to actually speak to the domination system, to speak to dehumanization, to use that language in any interactions he had with different governments and so forth. He was quite extraordinary in that role. And even to the point of the Yakama Nation submitting an amicus or friend of the court brief to the Supreme Court in the Cougar Den case and naming the doctrine of domination, dehumanization, genocide, and so forth in the legal brief, and naming the papal bulls, putting all of this kind of information in the amicus brief that went to the Supreme Court. And we know that the members of the Supreme Court, at least some of them, read it because the majority cited to that amicus brief several times, although not mentioning any of this content that I'm mentioning, but there were other parts of it that they mentioned, so we know they read it. That's the first time in the history of the U.S. that kind of information had ever reached the Supreme Court, because no attorneys before then had actually specified any of that kind of information. So this is an ongoing process to find the leaders that will do that, to find the people that will actually continue to understand how to express these arguments, these ideas, and marshal the evidence and information necessary to ask some very fundamentally important questions. Like, how is it that the United States has managed to get away with using Vatican papal bulls and the Bible and Christianity and the Old Testament idea of the chosen people and promised land against our nations and peoples all this time, and yet that's not any part of a current contemporary dialogue and discussion unless we bring it up? People understandably talk about racism, very important issue. There's so many important issues that they're talking about, but not talking about the domination system. Very occasionally it might get mentioned, but not really. So we need to be much more effective, in my view, in bringing this forward. And the question of how to actually change it, how to dismantle it, how to move to a different basis of reality is a very formidable question that we also have to attend to. And looking at the fact that there are probably a heck of a lot more questions than there are answers at this time. And what do we do about that as well? We're all implicated in so many of these horrible patterns now because we're all caught up in this technology and all these, an entire way of life premised upon the overconsumption of the Earth's resources. But, you know, it's interesting that there are so many ways in which we need to have that dialogue and discussion. And maybe that's beyond our time frame for today. But yeah, thank you for that question. Very important one.
Yeah, it would be really fun to have you back, Steven, and do like a 2 or 3 or 4 hour thing and dive much more deeply into the areas of this conversation that you never get a chance to dive into in an interview setting. So let me know in the future if you'd like to do that.
Sure.
Here's another question from Carla from our board. How far deep do you believe the doctrine of domination seeps into our individual and collective consciousness? How can the individual with aspirations of resisting the doctrine of domination identify in themselves the ways they may unknowingly perpetuate the basic aims and principles behind the doctrine of domination. That's a big one.
That's a big one, and it goes to the issue of human communication, respectful communication, and how do we achieve that? People kind of assume, I think, to a large extent, that simply because we're opening our mouths and emitting sounds and others are doing the same thing, that somehow we're in a process of communication. And oftentimes we're talking at odds and we're getting triggered and we're having reactions. And true communication, deep communication, requires deep listening and a tremendous amount of patience and being able to understand human knowledge systems, how they operate and how they function, and how much of what we assume is true is often completely untrue without us even knowing it. Yet we're making these very firm assertions based on the assumptions that we hold, which we never have examined. And that's federal Indian law. There's so much of federal Indian law that's incoherent, completely incomprehensible, contradictory, really maddening. Justice Clarence Thomas called it schizophrenic, which is probably a good term for it. But it's really necessary to go deep into it and have the patience necessary to figure out how to have those deeper conversations instead of immediately getting triggered and hurling epithets and thinking, oh yeah, we're going to cure the life, the ills of the planet by just getting more and more angry at one another and more divided and so forth. That's not a formula for success in my view. And so we have some very important communication patterns traditionally in terms of oratory and how to, and just we have a tradition as indigenous peoples of communication that is difficult in English, because the question about how we're implicated in this, a big part of it is the fact that we're using English. And more than 60% of English comes from the Latin language, the language of the Roman Empire, which is a language for winning, for overcoming, for dominating, for controlling. And so we're using that. And so there are the most subtle little examples that I could give if I had more time to explain how just the use of one pronoun can make a huge difference between making something sound like an accusation or something that's inclusive. And it's the exact same information, but the difference is one pronoun. So those are the subtleties. I mean, if we had more time, we could get into talking about indigenous languages, original nations languages, and the wisdom and the knowledge and the concepts that were evolved over thousands and thousands of years for human communication and for appreciating other life forms and one another in a deeply profound way. For example, in the Kumeyaay language, the greeting for hello or to greet someone is hauka, which translates to may the fire within you burn bright. Wow. How
Wow.
profound is that? Not just, oh, hey, how's it going? But may the fire within you burn bright. That's affirming your life force and everything about you as a spiritual being.
That's gorgeous. We have time for one last question that's going to come from me, and if you can answer it in less than a minute, that would be appreciated.
Sure.
And it's a 30-minute question, so sorry about that. Are you hopeful about the changes that are urgently necessary around the climate emergency and the various social emergencies that are going on, the collapse of ecosystems? Or, I mean, I'm sure that you see that these doctrines as absolutely critical in the catastrophe that we're now all living in. How do we get out of this? Is that even a possibility? In one minute or less, Stephen?
Well, that's where being spiritually centered comes into play. Having a spiritual connectedness with all forms of life, with one another as much as we possibly can, and realizing that we have the time that we have on this earth to do as much as we possibly can, and to try to make the most positive, beneficial, have the most positive, beneficial effect on the planet while we're here, and make the greatest contribution that we can. Beyond that, that would be a much longer conversation, but that's why acknowledging each and every day that this may be my last day, and I have to make the very most of it while I'm here and make the greatest contribution possible is so critically important in these perilous times.
Well, thank you. Well, it's been a real honor to know you at a distance all of these years, and it's been an honor to spend an hour with you today. And I'd love to interview you again for Community Rights US if you'd like that also. And I want to sign us off now as our hour is up. Remind
Thank you
people
so
to please
much.
make donations. Thank you, Steven, so very much.
Yes. Originalfreenations.com. Thank you so much.
Originalfreenations.com. And do you have an email or a Twitter handle that you'd like to share?
Info at originalfreenations.com.
Perfect. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Take
you
care.
so very much. Bye-bye.
Wanishi.